As he said, let's get right in it. So our first panel today, as they come to get seated, is Signature Management Enabling Survivability, Cold War to Ukraine. Future wars will be fought under ubiquitous ISR and electronic surveillance. To realize an information advantage, Army organizations must relearn the importance of operational security and tactical deception to achieve objectives. To moderate this panel, we have Sara Estill, the Director of Information Advantage in the Threat Systems Management Office for the United States Army's Program Executive Office for Simulation, Training, and Instrumentation. Ms. Estill's team is principally charged with evolving threat presentations across the competition continuum. Since 2017, Sara has been working with the TSMO on the evolution of threat mission of the organization. She also leads several strategic efforts for cybersecurity to include armed security cooperation with foreign allies, multi-domain threat testing programs for the Army, and other threat programs designed to test and evaluate cybersecurity and resilience. Ms. Estill has served in the Army for 10 years. She joined the Army as an all-source intelligence analyst in 2014. She led a commission and went to the dark side to the signal officer as a signal officer in 2017. I went to dark side. I like it. It's all good. That means she learned how to be a soldier first. Huh? She also has a bachelor's degree in biochemistry with a minor in military science. Sara, the floor is yours.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for that introduction. We're very happy to be here today at AUSA. So today, our AUSA Hot Topic panel is going to discuss signature management enabling survivability. So we're going to be discussing the previous Cold War and now to our current lessons learned from the Ukrainian-Russian war. So today, we're going to talk about how the concept of signature management requires an emphasis on protecting information to deny adversary advantage. So this is especially crucial to enable survivability during competition to and on the battlefield, because the information contact is going to permeate through conflict right now. Just as General Barrett stated this morning, we are in current information combat. So we have to see the competition phase different because we are in continuous combat with our adversaries. We are under persistent surveillance, and the information that we are being presented with and that we are presenting to our adversaries is allowing our adversaries and our current commanders to learn lessons that can be used in future stages of war. So the panel is actually going to explore the specific topics of ubiquitous technical surveillance, the contemporary application of that as it relates to operational security and deception in the modern battlefield, as well as the innovation and culture changes for the Army to maximize signature management capability and enhance our survivability. So key takeaway for this panel is to ensure that the modern Army must adjust to the era of ubiquitous observation in order to protect this critical information now in competition, as understanding that information is equating to threat initiative, and we need to focus on reducing the threat commander's decision space and enabling our blue commander's decision spaces. So with that, I think we've got about an hour up here. So I'm going to ask some specific questions to the panel, and then we absolutely want to hear from the audience and all of you. So, starting off, are we doing introductions for everybody? Well, I'll hand it over. So if you want to introduce yourself and.
Sure. So
go ahead.
Yeah, so Peter Singer, I wear a couple of hats. One, strategist at New America, nonprofit think tank, and secondly, managing partner at Useful Fiction, which is a company that helps with strategic narrative, in particular, bringing together creative and storytelling with nonfiction projects, and have written a number of books on the nonfiction and fiction front.
Joe Macri, Army civilian, actually work for Sara. So if you have any problems with what I say, she'll be available at lunchtime. I've been fortunate enough to work information operations, information advantage, and information protection at the OSD Joint Staff and Army levels for a long time. So I'm looking forward to having a conversation on what I feel is a very underinvested component to what information advantage represents for the Army.
Chris Lowe, I'm a retired Army officer, also an information operations officer. I had the good fortune as well of having been assigned briefly to U.S. Army Cyber Command, so very aware of their particular requirements. I'm currently working at Oracle, where I'm trying to help the Department of Defense solve data management problems. And I've done fairly extensive research into the origins of information operations doctrine, radio electronic combat, and how we emerge to the really problem that we've got today with signature management.
Good morning, Sean Heidgerken. I'm currently the public affairs officer at U.S. Central Command. But prior to that, I've spent the bulk of my career actually in the information operations career field. And so had an opportunity to look closely both at the history, but more recently what has happened signature management wise in Ukraine, as well as what's currently ongoing in the central region as we look forward to it. So look forward to the discussion and the questions today.
Thank you, everybody. So with that, let's start with introducing what we the definition of ubiquitous technical surveillance. So when we talk about digital dust and UTS, let's set a baseline for the audience so they really understand what we're talking about. Does anybody want to go through kind of the definition of UTS, the relevance of that in today's environment? General Barrett mentioned earlier the low barrier to entry. So let's highlight specifically what we mean by those things. Somebody want
to? I guess I won that one first. All right. We'll start the bar really low then and graduate from it. So I think UTS means a lot of different things, a lot of different people. There's an industry definition from IEEE that talks about the content and the metadata of the system. There's government kind of definitions that are working that talk about it from a source of capture of the data and metadata. So you can go from kind of at the very beginning of, hey, there's cell phones everywhere, and grow all the way up to a graduate level definition of the system of system, this ecosystem of digital transactions that we have. I think for the purposes of this discussion, understanding the content and context of the information and the value the threat puts on it is a critical part that what the Army needs to use as the definition in terms of operationalizing and making a working framework for us to get after this from a signature management perspective. General Barrett talked about competition. And if you, I had the pleasure of having a discussion with Lieutenant General Beagle, and he has this onion chart that he used kind of to get after this problem set and this definition. And he talks about how an adversary understands, and they can sense, and they can detect, and they can hit. If we put a horizontal kind of timeline on that, from competition to conflict, and we look at the type of data that's available on Google, which is a zero barrier of entry, to the type of location-rich and temporally discrete information that you can buy for $35,000, and you put that against the competition to conflict continuum using General Beagle's onion chart, you can see that for years, we may divulge content and context of our critical information and allow the adversary to understand us over time to provide them with a lot of different courses of action at the time and place of their choosing to get initiative and to take advantage of us in the information dimension. So from a technical perspective, I'm sure I probably talked more than they wanted me to, but you guys told me to go first. Culturally, the Army needs to get away from thinking this is a cell phone problem and understand the information that we are disclosing and the content and context of that information, and how do we need to arm and prioritize our protection forces to inform our commanders of what the risk is today's OAIs, tomorrow's OAIs, and do forward-based denial planning integrated across echelon. I don't know if you guys want to.
I mean, the only context I would add is that it's possible to think of ubiquitous technical surveillance as like an aberrant feature, like a bug, but it's actually it isn't even a feature. It's the system doing its thing. What I mean by that is, for a ubiquitously networked society to interact, to be efficient, it has to have, every device essentially has to have an address. It's got an IP address or mobile subscriber identity. Every single, it's got to have a location, so it's got to have some location services, whether that's GPS. It's got to have the ability to perform, basically automatic identification, data capture from device to device. So it's got to have technologies like QR codes, RFID tags, optical character recognition, you name it. It's got to have emissions. And all of that, those transactions have to be stored and basically put into storage, into database. And then increasingly, the way that the society is moving, obviously with the development of AI and machine learning, is to apply complex advanced algorithms against that data to derive added value. So we are all living in that space as an Army, or as individuals in the Army. Our programs live in that space. The industrial base lives in that space. And increasingly, that will, because of machine learning, will become more and more pervasive. So an example that's obvious is that is biometric payments. I don't know what the Army's particular policy is on the soldiers' use of biometric payments, but within a few years, it seems like just about everybody will be paying, will be using ear pay or face pay or something like that. And that implies reposing all that data somewhere. So those are the reason that's important to think in those terms as a feature or as the system itself, as opposed to kind of a threat or an aberrant feature, is that when we think about architecting our battlefield of things, we have a set of choices within that, I think, to think smartly about how we do that so that we preserve the signatures that we want to preserve. In other words, that we don't give away too much.
Yeah, and to bring out a practical application of what Joe and Chris just described, the vast bulk of the global economy relies on shipping to get its activities moved. And what we've seen currently happening in the Red Sea with the Houthi attacks against international shipping there is that the system that was designed to make that shipping more efficient, more safe, and just get us all of the stuff that we want to have happen has got an inherent bug in it, in that the automatic identification system, which is the ship's beacons that they have on as they travel throughout the world, so that the company can make sure that they're on track to get there, so they can, the port that they're going to knows when they're going to get there to make sure they've got the stevedores to unload. All these things rely on this data. It tells everybody exactly where you are with GPS. The Houthis are using that because it's publicly available. You can get a subscription, you can see it, and then they can put their one-way attack drones, their anti-ship ballistic missiles, etc., at that point in time, or they can put something into a search pattern to go find it where it should be. Now, add on to that to the fact that shipping is all about efficiency. So ships' captains, even if they turn off their AIS when they enter into a endangered area, you can pretty much assume that their behavior is not going to change. They're going to continue to drive in a straight line at a set course and speed, because that's what's efficient. And it's all about making the money, which is what this whole thing's about in the commerce. But if you deconstruct that, it allows that tracking. So at the operational level, there's that. Human beings would behave the same way with our phones and the other things that we're on, is that we are going to continue on a set trajectory. It's very rare the person can really change things that's going to be able to hide. So you can turn your cell phone off, but you've already the history already tells you where you're probably going to go. And it's how do we begin to think in those terms as we go in the future?
And just one add there is that it seems like, the user-centered design and the way that we design systems today, I mean, is for good reasons explicitly trying to take out complexity out of the equation, which means that you're essentially driving the range of choice about signature out of the user's purview, right? And you can actually experience this. There must have been some legislation which now requires websites to disclose whether they're using cookies or not, and giving you basically access to their privacy policy. Well, that's an example of that used to sit in the background unbeknownst to you, but because of an exogenous factor somewhere, they've been forced to present that to you, and now you're finally getting the opportunity to toggle on signature or toggle off signature. Well, I mean, every device we use, I imagine most weapon systems are essentially pushing the signature choice to the background. The compute decisions, the IT plumbing decisions, they're too complex for most people to do. And so for efficiency purposes, it's important to, but we probably need to think about that as we architect the force of the future.
So I'm the outsider voice on this, so I'm going to be a little bit wonky and take us back further in history. So in the last industrial revolution, there was a English philosopher called Jeremy Bentham, and he talked about the idea of how would you behave in a world where your every move was observed, and he called the idea a Panopticon. Bentham was also a bit of an amateur architect. And in that industrial revolution, they had a problem they'd never had before, which was how do you handle when people have been working in their homes to working in this new thing called a factory? How do you make sure everybody's working hard, working equally? And so Bentham said, you know what, my idea of a Panopticon, I'm going to design a building like that, a building kind of like this, where your every move could be observed. And he said, this will be the perfect workplace. It turned out people don't like that. And in 1818, his perfect workplace became the first modern prison. And so we've always had this duality with the idea of a Panopticon. Wouldn't it be wonderful if your every move could be observed? Oh my God, that's horrible. That's dystopian. Okay, flash forward to today. I would argue we're in the middle of a new industrial revolution. When you think about all the different technologies that are out there, some of which have been mentioned, I think we're going to talk a lot about them over the course of the next couple of days. Unmanned systems, satellites, AI. Essentially what it's brought to the battlefield is a quasi version, and to civilian life. You've talked about these. It's kind of a quasi version of a Panopticon. Wherever you operate, wherever you go, you're leaving a signature as a civilian, whether it's online to, we were all tracked when we came in here, to Ukraine. It's the ubiquitous sensor. It's everything from unmanned systems by the thousands. It's government satellites. It's commercial satellites. I mean, you can, for example, ironically enough, track how effective fires have been in Ukraine using civilian satellites designed to track forest fires. To social media side of it, the Ukrainians report that they're pulling in 10,000 different items a day of useful intelligence from social media that they're using for everything from strategic level awareness, where are the Russians massing, to micro tactical, here is a single foxhole with a single Russian soldier in it. Let's go send a drone to go kill him. So we've got that coming together, and I would argue, so we're moving into this sort of Panopticon. Oh, by the way, to use your example of the Houthis, if you try and go dark, if you turn off your tracker, you've just revealed to the world what you're up to, the absence of information. And so I'm going to push, what I'm going to end on is a proposition that's maybe a little bit controversial, which is you will not be able to hide. You will not be able to reduce your signature to zero. If you do, that's revelatory. And so the issue of signature management actually now has to involve more thinking, not about reduction, but deception. And I'll leave it on that just by saying it. There's an irony that it's something we used to be really, really good at the strategic and tactical level. it's not as foundational for us in everything from our doctrine to our training as it is for example, the PLA.
Okay, that was great. So agreed with all the points there. Hopefully that helps everyone understand kind of the problem space that we're talking about here. Something that I would say though, to end out that note is that hopefully the commanders and the members in this audience aren't walking away with thinking that it's possible for us to hide everything. So I think that what the panel just discussed was that understanding the risk and understanding the signatures that are pervasive, that are ubiquitous, that live forever, that's step one. So if we understand these things, then we can get after other types of scenarios and opportunities. But you're not going to be able to hide everything. You can reduce risk by understanding what signatures you're presenting and what's most critical. But yeah, that was a great conversation with the panel. So with that, let's talk about some of the contemporary applications of this. So lessons learned from applying information protection as it relates to operational security and deception in the modern battlefield right now. So with the current Ukrainian conflict, there's a lot of lessons learned and open source articles specifically talking about command posts, the spectrum management. Do we want to start talking about some of the lessons learned from the current conflict?
I'll let you go first this time.
I'll just add, to build on the prior point. I mean, I think one of the key lessons, and it was staring us in the face, if you're going to use the command post example, is that it's going to be incredibly difficult to reduce your signature to 0 unless you're going completely old school back to using, flags and pigeons, and that means you've lost all effectiveness. And by the way, pigeons can be tracked too. So you are going to have to reduce the size of your command posts. Secondly, you're going to have more distributed and building in resilience. And third, I think most importantly is going to be mobile. So sorry, and I added resilience also adds into the deception. The idea of that's what is it called? Magruder's principle. Feed into, make them think that here's my shiny, attractive command post, take it out, as opposed to where my real one is that's hidden. But then there's also going to have to be mobility. At least from open source, the Ukrainians are reporting that the time from detection of some kind to a fire's coming in is roughly 3+ minutes. And so think about our current tactical command post. Think about our current, for people here working on fires, it gives real meaning to shoot and scoot. And so I think there needs to be a comprehensive rethink, everything from acquisitions to training to take this into account.
And I think to build on the historical aspect of in the deception timeline or deception discussion, if we first off, has anybody read the 1988 freshly published Battlefield Deception Manual? Chapter 1, line 1, we've lost the art of deception. And I would argue that we've continued to struggle since then. As you look back to the glory days that we look, in World War II, where we had Patton and we had the Ghost Army, et cetera. But the principles of what we do still are the same. And it's what do we show the adversary and when do we show the adversary that? Because we've never been able to hide. Flags can always be seen, otherwise they don't work. That's why they're orange. And then the pigeons can be shot down or whatever. But as we look in this new, more connected environment, how do we place things in there that draw the adversary to place our commanders at a position of advantage? I like to think of it as an attack function, vice a defensive function, where we're like, how are we preventing the adversary from having advantage? But how are we gaining that advantage? One of the things that's happening in Ukraine, and you've seen it in the public, it's been publicly acknowledged, is they've taken very simple aspects of their economy and are making very simple decoys. not these high-end, looks just like, cost almost as much as the real thing kind of a decoy that people tend to want to go towards, but a wheel with a pipe that looks like a howitzer, because at the tactical level, the decisions are still being made on that counterfire within the 3 minutes that oftentimes, you know, the adversary will strike a decoy instead of striking the real thing. It's just giving too many options for them at that point in time. So I think that as we look at that, we have to keep our focus on how are we placing ourselves in that advantage as we move forward.
Yeah, I know we're talking explicitly about signature management here, but one of the lessons from the Cold War was, or at least that the Soviets discovered, was that in what General Westmoreland referred to as the electronic battlefield, it's not sufficient just to do Maskarovska. I mean, essentially, it's a cybernetic contest between two armies about who can distribute information, high quality, target quality information the best. And in that contest, just confounding an adversary for a moment in time might give you a certain kind of advantage. But the reality is you got to do something about degrading his ability to process information. In other words, it's not the boundary between what we used to think of as offense and defense sort of begins to merge. The best defense is offense. The best offense is defense, protecting your own information flows. And in that light, you began to you saw signature management, or what the masquerading in the Russian context, paired with electronic warfare, SIGINT, and indeed, I mean, cyber didn't exist as a thing, but today, obviously, that would be in the same bucket, and lethal fires. And that doctrine, radio electronic combat, later we appropriated that doctrine and called it first command C3CM, and then later command and control warfare. And then in the 90s, it was rebranded information operations. So at the germ of information operations was the idea that signature management wasn't enough. And that's a key insight.
So my understanding and extrapolation from the current conflict is they're protecting, they're doing survivability, they're doing some tactical deception. So they're doing these signature management effects because they have this engine room that understands what they look like, what their systems look like. They know the signatures, they know the patterns of life. They have a resource constrained personnel as well as fiscal. So they prioritize what's important to them to protect and where to do tactical deception and where they need to do survivability through tactics like survivability hops or cheap capability made of balsa wood and tires. So they have an input on what matters to them. They have an engine room that can understand and touch the signatures associated to their own force. So the information dimension signature database. And if we look at the process they have and we try to frame it into how we could replicate their quick successes, quick adaptability, quick transformation after contact, it's a good lesson learned for us to see how that might fit in our structure. When you look at the horizontal touch points, whether it's from a PO, a COE, a DevCom perspective, are we framed and structured to provide the technology and the tactics to enable our forces to have that engine room that knows what we look like in the information dimension, and a commander can prioritize what to protect and where initiative needs to be created. And I think that that's a valuable lesson learned that we can get from that right now. Not at the technology level, not at the prerogative level, not at the priority level, but how could we actually do that? And I think that we can actually find where they're being successful and where we can look at our structure organizationally and try to enable that.
If I could add one quick thing on it, that one of the so Colin Gray, the great writer on strategy, talked about the key to success in this space is having a cultural understanding of your adversary. And so if you look at the examples that you used and you used as well, actually all three of you used, one of the sort of unstated things that the Ukrainians bring to the table is a inherent understanding of their adversary, and not just kind of culture and language, but many of them literally were trained in the same doctrine, the same units. They understand the weapon systems at an intuitive level, and that is not something that we have with our adversaries in competition and potentially conflict. And you can definitely see, go to we were running an event on strategic narrative skills for a group of roughly 30 Army folks working on IO and PSYOPs, et cetera. And we asked them, how many of you are working on China PLA related issues? And 2 hands went up. That's not the right answer. I mean, that's the actual answer. That's not the answer that I think we would want.
Yeah, on that question of understanding ourselves and what sort of our signature profile is, I think it's it's an interesting time because the Army is moving to digital engineering, and this holds the promise for digital twins of important systems, and I think there are broader cultural questions about how the adversary behaves from a cognitive perspective, but at least how do our weapon systems appear under adversary collection, under technical surveillance, and any kind of whatever that discipline is. I think we can do that. The modeling exists. It could be done. It would be very interesting. That way, essentially, we would have a near real-time view about what our systems emit and how they appear to threat.
Real quick, I don't want anyone to walk away thinking that we need to do that for every single system or every single maneuver tactic, right? So if we had a prioritized framework from FORSCOM, AFC, CAC, HQDA, and they framed out tactical priorities, they framed out system priorities, and they framed out the potentially competition, crisis, and conflict activities that we do that might forecast signatures that we wish we didn't know that we were doing 10 years later, that drove what that signature repository, that drove what the new tactics given the UTS framework, that drove what the threat informed decision-making might be in regards to that commander's risk. I think that would be a great place to be.
And I don't know, I'm sorry, you're never gonna be able to ask any questions. I don't know if we're doing this now, and if we are, I do know we're not doing it at a sufficient level. You could also integrate this a lot more into exercises and wargaming and training with the intent not only to gather that database that you're talking about to better understand ourselves, but secondly, you would be creating a database of potential signatures, so to speak, to use in deception operations. And so it's the parallel of Sean mentioned the Ghost Army. One of the things that it did that was kind of revolutionary was its ability to record what tanks sounded like starting up. And then its big new technology was it had loudspeakers that for the first time sounded realistic. And so they were able to broadcast the sound of tanks starting up. So what's our version of that we're gathering on scale, not just to understand ourselves and what's our signatures and how do we reduce it for each individual system, but also that, this is what a brigade talk sounds like digitally from one of our exercises. Let's deploy it in a fake way, but it's hyper realistic because it was gathered in a setting that was realistic.
Yeah, and to end on that point, I think Today, it is not the national strategic ISR that's identifying these signatures that the panel just talked about. So there's low barrier to entry. There's public and commercially available information that's able to identify signatures specifically as it's related to command posts. So you just heard several examples of what that is. And that's the point, is we have to understand that we live in an information dense environment, and we have to understand what we can do with that. So with that, I'm going to tie in one of our final questions and actually a question from the audience. So Chris, you talked about cultural and structural changes. What specific Army changes do you see us needing to invest in to transform and get after this active information protection? And also to add on to that, a question from the audience is, so what should the U.S. Army start doing right now, and what should we stop doing right now?
Yeah, I mean, I'm in industry, so I don't pretend to know how to tell the Army what it needs to do, but clearly I think the Army's making tremendous strides, as I mentioned, with digital engineering, with separating software from hardware, in a number of really important ways. I think it seems to me relevant that the Army really look at how it leverages that different acquisition strategy, including model-based open systems architectures, to try to enable this mission area. That's point one. I mean, not to get into any specifics there, but I think there's significant opportunity. Be happy to share my thoughts, 1v1 if you're interested in that. Second, I think Joe's comment about seeing yourself, know thyself, is really important. And it was once good enough to know thyself just in the electro-optical space, meaning to know what things looked like. But you actually have to know how it looks like in the mirror world. I'm using Glertner's mirror world here as the cop. So in essence, everybody's got a major data management problem. They've got to fuse data. They've got to present it on a cop for decision. The adversary does too. That is not distributed evenly. It is not just because we are able to do very sophisticated things in places doesn't mean that all of our adversaries can. It's amazing in the Ukraine space how much just basic visual deception seems to work. Okay, so we are a long way away from the super Panopticon, but we are maybe in some theaters but not others. So I guess the question there is, how do we look to specific adversaries given known capabilities of those adversaries? That's a key investment area, I think. Those are two areas. Yield to anyone else that has comment.
Yeah, I'm have no problem telling the Army where to spend money. From my foxhole, which would be informed a little tiny bit, but obviously I don't know what I don't know. I don't know if the Army does a great job, and we've said it a couple different times, with regards to emulating what information advantage creates, or what we need to do to establish and sustain that during competition and crisis, in a temporally represented way where we are. So not a 2-week jump in, but we're talking about years of content and context that we are affording threat to access and understand. So I don't know if we do that repeatedly. I do know that the Army invests a lot of money to make sure our weapon systems are survivable and sustainable. And if information advantage matters to the Army, then we need to have threat-informed assessments and evaluations on how we're protecting our information, because I think everyone has said that that's critical. So if we are doing measures and countermeasures, and we have tactics and we have techniques and we have technologies, and we're using that to deny threat access to our critical information, the indicators thereof over time, are we doing a good job of assessing how that works? Are we framing out what works and what doesn't? What spectrum matters in your theater, and the TTPs he's using could be bled into another theater to inform them? I don't know if we have that. And a lot of the changes that I would recommend if someone was listening would be hard to implement, because from my foxhole's perspective, we have a PEO tank, and we have a ACM and a COE that deals with ground combat. And that kind of includes tanks, right? We have a lot of requirements on tanks. And if you look at the major systems that we have, the Army is almost structured in the PPB&E process and OPR process around these major muscle movement of systems or units. And here we are. How do I horizontally integrate, prioritize, and invest in something that I can't put neatly in one place? That is a hard problem. But if information advantage is where the Army wants to go, I would feel that priority and resourcing to get after that structural change, or at least a parallel structure for this discipline, is necessary.
Well, and I would add to your parallel discussion, Joe, as we look at these future acquisitions and as we go into the design of what we think the Army needs to fight the next wars, we have to be thinking about it in those terms ahead of time. So what other signatures do I want this to present to place us at a position of advantage, or we intuitively think of the defensive side. Artillery batteries are going back to running wire because you can't hack wire. Well, you can, but you got to be really close to do it. And so as we design our future systems, what other things do we need to go? What is the kit bag that comes along with that new tank that allows me to say that the tank isn't here, but perhaps there's one over here, or maybe we have more than we say we do. And I think right now we're doing that as an additive and an add-on and an afterthought, instead of putting that into the design process as we go forward, perhaps.
Yeah, just one observation there. I know we're running on time, but the more you make the signature management game complex and distribute it itself, the more that a control plane seems to set up as a requirement, which to my knowledge doesn't exist. It sits at the unit by the each's level, the singletons level today.
I was just going to say one quick thing, because I know we've talking about the systems and tanks and all kinds of great stuff. And the only other question I would be, 5 years from now, the workforce doing this work is where? Prioritized, enabled? Is this a dedicated, both sides of the coin focus area at Echelon, or is this another duty as assigned where protection is everyone's job, and so that means no one actually is doing it? Just a thought there.
So my praise would be, I think after a long time resisting, fighting against robotic systems, unmanned systems, drones, however you want to term them, the Army as an institution and the DoD as an institution has basically sort of been forced by Ukraine to go, you know what, they really do matter in major conventional warfare. And we've seen a number of initiatives to push them out to the force, whether it's the testing at places like, Binning and Irwin, to Replicator initiative. That's the good. The however, the next is to stop thinking of them as only as fires. So yes, the Ukrainians are using small drones for taking out tanks. There's a lot of cool, exciting things that they can do in this space, not just on ISR collection, but a lot of the things that we've talked about on deception, signature, using small drones to be the mirror of a major combat system, to cheap and disposable, offers you a lot of options if you're willing to embrace it.
So no one's giving me the time. So can I keep going? Okay. All right. So there's a lot of questions up here. So I'm trying to consolidate and roll some of this up. So as the technology continues to evolve, and we're talking about evolving the signature management and ensuring that our forces are understanding this, does the panel have any recommendations as it relates to the integration of new technologies for initial military training? What does the combined training look like for this? And how do we get after actualizing information protection across the forces?
I'll jump on that first as the tech guy. So I think, one, every leader needs a baseline understanding of AI, not how to program, et cetera, but basically an understanding of what are its strengths, what are its weaknesses. So AI can be deceived, or it can self-deceive in many different ways. It can bring together these little whiffs of data that will allow you to connect the dots. But so the first would be that baseline understanding of AI as a key new technology area. A second technology area that we've talked about, I just mentioned, use of robotics, and since we all thought we had to end in 2 seconds, so what I was after there is the idea of using your unmanned systems to not just collect information on scale, but for example, to blast out alternative signatures on scale, to serve the role of the peasant out hunting with the king, and the king would say, you go into the forest and act really loud so that the lion will attack you, and then the lion reveals its position. There's a lot more that we can do with it if we're willing to view these systems as disposable. A third area, and it kind of relates to what I think it was you brought up, Sean, is to create physical artifacts that are, again, part of this sort of managing signature. So it can be it could literally be a tire and a pole. But one new technology area that I think we can embrace a lot more is 3D printing, which would allow you at the tactical edge to produce useful items, but you could also produce useful items. Let's stop thinking of it as just spare parts, but also I can create things that have different signatures. I can adjust to what Chris and Joseph have brought up, where maybe I'm giving away a certain signature right now on the tactical edge using 3D printing. The enemy's built up a database. If I look like X, I can change the way that I look on the edge. And so I think a lot more embrace of 3D printing would be neat. And then the final technology area, metamaterials, sort of new exotic materials that, again, open up some really cool things. So it's a poncho that reduces your IR signature. Things like that, or truly allows radar not to work against you. I think there's some exciting stuff there.
No, and Peter, to build on that, as you begin to understand how AI works, particularly in the electro-optical space, we're trying to find shapes, and then we have a high confidence that this shape is a tank, and it's a tank from this angle, based on the sun, based on the weather, based on the environment it's in. But how do we think as we're designing these new tanks that, again, Desert Storm folks, remember the old panels we used to put on the side of our vehicles that we could see? We would cast a shadow so we could see it with nods. We knew that was friendly. How do we take that concept and now alter the shape either in training so that day to day, this is what a tank looks like. So as they're flying things overhead, and collecting and building their database so that they understand when push comes to shove, they can find the tanks in the battlefield. How do we then alter that shape when it's time to actually go into the knife fight and work that piece? But I would say the other skill that we need to develop across the spectrum of training is the counter deception. We know that our adversaries are going to be trying to deceive us, and this is more than an intelligence function of how do we arm our commanders to detect when the adversary is trying to place us at a position of disadvantage through their use of signature management, and how are we thinking? This is a back and forth game. How are we thinking in that context as well, and training our forces to do that as well?
So I would say there's two other parts maybe. On the tech piece, there are lots of opportunities. I think one way structurally we could arm POs to take advantage of those would be if we can figure out a way to bake it in the survivability or the KPPs and KSAs that ASALT has framed out for Army weapon systems. How do you enable signature management from the very beginning of the design criteria? So I could turn off signatures and I could turn on signatures. So I could blast at thresholds, so I can minimize thresholds. So I can create noise floors across different types of systems autonomously through C2 and so forth. I think that is a great way to enable the plumbing to get after the effects that we've been talking about here. The other element of this is more from a planning construct in terms of how we can change the way we plan things. I think a lot of the times folks say information protection equals OPSEC. Okay, that's a security function and I did my training, so I'm great. If we can delineate OPSEC as we have it in the Army as a program management function where we fill out signs and have cool posters and I get my training done versus an active planning capability integrated with my 5 and 3, either reducing risk for my commander or creating opportunity for my commander. There's a new set of analysis that we need to bring into that where we talk about cumulative exposure over time. My unit's last 3 exercises, have I informed my commander that this is what the adversary saw? This is what they could develop, frame from that? What are the COAs based off of the fact that this is how I always exercise in competition? So they know my critical vulnerabilities of what I absolutely need when I'm actually going into conflict. I don't know if we prioritize that analysis to inform our commanders on how they can prioritize denial effects embedded within what our 5 and 3 are working on. So that's what I would say.
Okay, great. It looks like we've got 21 more minutes, so I'm going to ask you guys some more questions. So question here for the panel. How do we move at the speed of relevancy in the current Napoleonic construct of the DoD with the bureaucratic hurdles to our innovation? Palm cycles and constant experimentation prevents the normalization and standardization of modern technology as it relates to information and integration into lower echelons time now. This is further highlighted with the extremely slow lagging acquisition process.
Okay, go ahead and take this one, guys. I'm going to take this one. For 4 months, I've worked underneath ASALT, so I don't think I should get in trouble for this. I feel like what we just talked about and putting the plumbing into our requirements is a short-term gap to ensure that we have adaptability and speed later down the process. So if I had AFC, if I had proponent and .NOPF and I had ASALT and I had them together on a table to talk about how they can create the concept to requirements to the PPB&E now to enable pivoting and to enable quick adoption of technology later on, I think that would be a great discussion. It's almost like the Army needs an information advantage. How do we get there from here with AFC, with ASALT, and with TRADOC? And I think that would be a great discussion. There are a number of organizations across the force that focus on short-term RDT&E type of activities. There are a number of organizations that have S&T funds that can execute quick technology pilots. And obviously there's an ASALT that's working on the QUIP framework for the Army of Tomorrow and what those systems are and ensuring that they are meeting the suitability and survivability that's required. For this discipline, if I had the S&T folks and the RDT&E folks and the procurement folks in a room, and they were able to leverage those different types of appropriations and expediency, I think that the Napoleonic and slow adjectives that were used in that question might not be as relevant. I'm not informed enough to know if that IPT exists so that when a requirement or a gap is framed, we can execute current year, next year, and fill that in to ensure that the force is equipped. But I would love to be in that room if that IPT did establish.
We can kind of build a little bit on what the senior leaders said when they opened us up. And the campaign of learning can't just be a boilerplate because, you know, it's easy to say you're a professional, you're expected to learn your whole career. Why are we putting this idea? But the campaign of learning is as I understand it, it's going out there and not accepting no to the bureaucratic system. If you look what was done at 18th Airborne Corps, as they a couple years ago began the process of trying to figure out the C2 system of the future, the single pane of glass to help the commander in their decision process. 18th Airborne Corps and FORSCOM don't have money to do that. So you've got to, part of this development of our leaders is to go learn how to find OPM, other people's money, right? So the POM cycle has this money built into it, and it's in these little niche markets. You've just got to go find a way to go find it, grab it, and then, you know, work with our industry partners to help, you know, oftentimes move at a faster pace than we can move at. And so I think it's developing those leaders that do take that campaigning approach seriously, which is, you know, operations over time, and put that all together, and then just not take no for an answer, and just try things, and then we'll figure it out. Now, should we find a formalized system? Yes, but sometimes those formalized systems will also kill the ingenuity, because now you've got a checklist of everything you've got to do to get approval. But anyhow, just, I don't know how to end that comment. Sorry.
That was good. I think that the acquisition process is getting better, but I would go back to Joe's point at making sure that all of the right people are around the table at the right time. It's the same thing with cybersecurity. If you bake it in from the beginning, it makes it a lot easier, and then we can bake in survivability up front. We can program for it. We can have the right people at the right table. But if you try to do it down the road, it's so hard to get it put into the process. I know from our foxhole, working with the Information Advantage Campaign of Learning, from TSMO's perspective, we see a lot of people in the space trying to get after these problems. But General Stanton told us at one of the IAESGs, like, let's stop admiring the problem and let's get after it. And I think that one of the first steps of getting after it is what Joe said. It's making sure that there's representation across the workforce, and that is actually taken forward to create action against it. Go ahead.
So obviously there's and it's spoken about a need for, you know, acquisition reform, et cetera. But I wanted to get after that last point, that recognition. Okay, we've got a problem. Let's get after it. There's a strategy. There's a leader decision that's made within, at least on the corporate side. 70% of change programs fail because of, not so ironically to this topic here, an organizational narrative problem. And basically it breaks down into three parts. Either leadership has not sufficiently made the case for change. If we don't do X, Y will happen. So in this space, the case for change is kind of under, like, if we don't do X, we're going to lose. Bad things are going to happen. That's not understood across the system. To get that sense of urgency, let's get after it. The second narrative problem is this is what the endpoint looks like. This is the promised land. We could be X if we all get together, if we move towards it. I don't think there is yet a sufficient vision on a lot of these of what that promised land would look like. But the interesting thing, and this is on the corporate side, but from my own very limited experience compared to you all within the Pentagon, the third problem is it's the middle layer, it's the program manager, it's the bureaucracy, et cetera, who basically, when it comes to narrative, does not see themselves as a character in the story of change, or even worse, sees themselves as a character in the story of change, and they are the victim. And so what they do is they basically try and ride it out. They carry out a slow insurgency, slow things down, don't pass on the money, say, we can't do that here. And so after several months, you know, we've had this big program, big announcement, leadership is behind it, and it just kind of dies out. And so, again, I think there's, you know, to get that sense of urgency, you've got to think of it as a larger campaign that includes these three elements. Why do we need to change? What is our endpoint? And how are we all characters in this story of change? How are we all heroes in this story of change?
I just want to, real quick on this, we kind of didn't question the question in terms of what it pre-proposed. This is a area of mental agility. this is an area of brain might be more powerful than 100,000 widgets that we can pump out with a big budget. So if ingenuity and innovation is at the soldiers, at that edge, how can we not worry about acquisition bureaucracy of widgets and enable them to implement the innovation that they're thinking about at their echelon with their critical information, whether it's competition, crisis, and conflict. And I know we have that man, train, equip framework, and I know that the budget is based off the equip side because that's where all the money is, and that's fine. But if we can pull back from the tech piece and understanding data, the data piece is huge and got it. But at the end of the day, if I'm talking about what I need to protect and ingenuity at the level of the soldier of where that protection requires or where that tactical deception opportunity, how can we actually change the system to enable that ingenuity?
It's there. I mean, the Bocage at Normandy was defeated by a junior soldier welding steel to the front of a tank based on some things he'd learned from the farm back home. And I think sometimes we underestimate the power of our formations to come up with that innovation if we just present them the problem that's out there. And sometimes the job of the leader is to frame the problem and then let the forces run with it. And often those are at a no cost. And perhaps that's part of that, back to Peter's point of, what things do we need to bake in from the beginning of our training is continuing that concept and that heritage that we have, quite frankly, in our military of coming up with those on the ground solutions and then taking the best ones and bringing them forward.
I would love it if the Army had a PEO Legos and there was a quad con at the appropriate echelon of all the crap that, whether it's 3D printers, whether it's a bunch of balsa wood, here's some signature management stuff, X, Y, Z, it doesn't matter. And yet, it just seems to me that at certain echelons, the $30,000 or the $100,000 so hard to come by. So how does PEO Legos equip the basic tools to enable the innovation and ingenuity that they have? And I think that actually would solve a lot of things.
And I'm going to be awful and bring in so you brought in World War II history. I'm going to bring in a Navy World War II history thing, which is, so the key here is not just pushing it down to the tactical level and embracing experimentation and learning, but it's also having a deliberate structure. So experimentation is best when you have multiple experiments running simultaneously. So in 1942, the US Navy had a parallel problem where they felt they had lots of new sensors, radar, and they felt overwhelmed by all the different kind of data coming in, how to make use of it for everything from navigation to finding planes to finding targets. And so the order went out, every ship is to create a combat information center somewhere in the ship where you figure out how to bring together all of this data and apply it to your needs. Different than how we would do it today. They didn't tell each ship how to do it. They just said, you need to create a CIC. And you had multiple different models. And then ultimately they found the best type by having all these different types, these ongoing experiments. So you could think a lot of these is like, there's, you have this problem, but we're not going to tell you how to solve it. And then we're going to learn by how different groups come after this problem. What's your structure? And again, back to the kind of the Napoleonic question, is it led to some really interesting insights. Like, for example, the best place for the captain to be was not on the bridge of the ship, even though that's where they had always been since the Napoleonic era. It was instead to be near that radar that was displaying everything out there. So I think there's a parallel there. It's not just experimentation, it's ensuring to have multiple experiments coming up with different approaches to the same problem.
Okay, so I think we have time for perhaps one more question. We've got about 8 minutes left. So I'm going to try to tie a couple of these in together. There are several questions specifically talking about data. This question is for you, Sean. So Is there, or how are we limiting the Houthis' access to data types such as AIS commercial data? Is this even feasible? Obviously, the U.S. does not own the commercial ships sailing in the Red Sea. So how should we, or how are we providing advice to ships so they are not attacked? Coupling that with other data types, folks are talking about, what do I do about the data that exists as it relates to patients' data that's in the field for the signatures that are being presented. So what do we do about this data issue?
Are we have ships been advised to turn the AIS off? Yes, but again, it's the question of where do they turn it off? You know, they turn it off as they're crossing over from the in the Indian Ocean before they even get close to the Gulf of Aden, and it's that same linear problem that ships have. And it's the risk that those shipping companies are running, quite frankly, and the Houthis are getting even better. So they're not just using the AIS; they have set up a series of radar sites along their coastline, essentially going out and purchasing the same small things you get at Bass Pro Shop to put on your boat when you're going out fishing. They purchase that and then network them along the lines. So I think it's less of is there a way to limit it? No, because AIS isn't. Not only is it not, it's a global system. It's not a U.S. government system. We can't turn it off. We can't block it. I'm not sure. And this is an Army crowd, but I'm not sure how many people fully understand the murky world that is international shipping, as to who owns flags, mans, equips, and whatever on a ship. But I see we've got some Navy folks here, but or Marines, sorry, but maritime folks. As we look at what that looks like, it's how do we limit that? We've not yet found the command center where they're pulling all of this in. So I don't have the answer to that, unfortunately. They have been advised in multiple ways, but the ships that have been struck have tended to have their AIS on.
So something I would add to what you just said, though, is like you have to understand the totality of the data and how the sensing is occurring. So if you turn the AIS data off,
Right.
But what Sean just said was, well, there's other sensors that are set up to look at those particular ships. So it really goes back to understanding the totality of the problem before you just jump into solutions.
And I think we used to look at data and information in a way that we could perhaps overwhelm the adversary's decision-making process by giving them so much data that it put them into some form of a vapor lock. With the current technologies that are just resident off the shelf, using some simple AI tools that are out there, it helps cull through that data in a way that I'm not sure right now we can overwhelm. And you balance that with the problem of no data. That black hole tells you something too, and now you can analyze that. We haven't quite figured it out, but it's a great test bed. There's a lot of different things being tried there, whether it's taking out the sensors, whether it's advising ships to travel in a certain way. You've actually seen reports where the ship's captain, a ship will be hit, the ship's captain will report that they weren't hit, just so that it doesn't give the data back to the Houthis to then restrike, because they think that there might be an opportunity there. Plus, there's also the financial side of it. That raises insurance rates, which it raises the cost of shipping, and all these things are intertwined in a way that is not typically understood or thought about, I think, in the military environment. So perhaps the real answer is this is not a problem that the military can necessarily solve on its own. It's something that we've got to pull in these feeds and these relationships that we've got with others that are out there.
Okay, so with that, I think we're about to close out the panel. So as the technology continues to evolve, I think what we've heard from the panel members today is that there's a variety of tactics as well as technologies that can be used to help reduce or understand signatures for military forces, so we can maintain elements of surprise, evading detection, actualizing information protection, and achieving objectives with minimal risk. So with that, I know there was a few questions that we didn't get a chance to get to. We'll be available on the networking break and would love to talk to you all. Thank you so much for having us.